turn to Manish. Yeah. Okay, great. Hello and welcome to Invest in India, special coverage from London as we count down to the Prime Minister's visit and as we also get you the mood of investors here on ground from the UK and what they're looking forward to and expecting going ahead when it comes to Indian markets and policy. Let me welcome in our guests today. Joining us, Manish Singh, Crossbridge Capital, and also Raju Kamath of Kuvera Capital. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you.
Manish, let me start off with you. We have just seen, of course, a loss for the BJP when it comes to the state elections. And that's interesting because a lot of attention that's being focused on the government's reform drive just ahead of the Prime Minister's visit. I want to get a sense from you. Markets seem to have somewhat discounted the entire turmoil we've seen when it comes to politics over the last few days. But what's your view as an investor? Does it change your perception at all going forward?
See, I don't think it does, because if you look in terms of legislative impact of how many more seats BJP would have got in Rajya Sabha, it was just 5. So not in terms of legislative impact. And also, if you look at in terms of big ticket reform that the government has been talking about, I think that this jolt may actually end up helping government to think that, okay, it's kind of a reality check in what it has been doing. But there are many things that the government can do for that. It doesn't need the legislative agreement. I mean, if you're talking about, reducing the government stakes in PSU, it doesn't need to be passed by the Lok Sabha or something, right? And the same thing is about if you are going to have an unambiguous legal system in the sense of how you treat corporate law or MAT, all these things that came up, you don't need the legislative approval. So I think there are a lot of things that government can do, and the global macro picture is still very much favoring India in terms of energy prices are not going anywhere anytime soon, and the government is still committed, and all the ministers, they come out and they keep talking all the time, including what they said this afternoon about FDI reform. So I think that still keeps me positive.
Okay, and I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more of those FDI reforms momentarily. But Raju, let me get your perspective as well. How are you feeling about the current situation?
Regarding the election specifically, I tend to agree. I don't think it's going to have a significant impact, if at all. I think if the BJP had won, it would have been a marginal positive. But I think that if you look at what they've done with regard to the SEBs, the PSU banks, they don't need that win. I think it may, as Manish said, accelerate some of the reforms because it may be a sort of a knee-jerk, maybe a jolt to them to wake up. But certainly, from our perspective, we wouldn't see it as a particular massive negative. And
right. It's interesting you both say that, because we've in fact been speaking to investors earlier today as well, and even Jeff Chaudhary, for instance, talking about how he feels it was something required to jolt the government into action. And today, a day ahead of Diwali, we're seeing all that action on the FDI front. Do you again, though, feel it's a lot of noise? Are you worried about the execution? Or, what are some of the takeaways from some of the reforms announced today?
I think, I mean, as an investor, I think clearly, the easy thing to say, do you want more done quicker, and that's the thing.
Absolutely.
But if you look at what's actually happened, if you look at, for example, road building, that's taken off phenomenally. If you look at the potential projects with the Japanese investment in trains, I think there've been a lot of positives. And actually, they're the political kind of imperatives to how to get these reforms too. But I think the general direction of travel is in the right direction. You've seen they've made these marginal changes with regard to PSU banks and bringing in private sector bank people. I don't think that really affects it. I think you need to change incentives. In my ideal world, you privatize these things. But nevertheless, the direction of travel is positive. And I think on the ground, and just speaking to people, you get the sense that there is a lot of goodwill and a lot of expectation as well, and some of which is being met.
We've had some of the biggest corporates as well come out and speak about how it possibly needs more time, how the government possibly needs more time for some of the execution to take place. Would you agree, Manish, or would you have liked to see more?
See, I think that government will need time. I do agree with that. Could it be done faster? I mean, you would hope so, but the fact is that you know how India works, and having grown up in India, I know how it works. So I think you have to cut some slack for the government, so long as the intention is clear, and which is very important. But for me, it has always been about the whole MAT issue that happened was not required. Right. You already have you're fighting a challenging battle, to reform your country, but then it comes these surprises which should never have happened, because at the end of the day, you are looking for FDIs and you're looking for capital, and the last thing you want to spook the people.
And you've been talking about this for a while, Manish. So you still feel lack of clarity on that front? I know some of the bigger cases still need some resolving, but the government has been fairly vocal on trying to say that it's taking the right steps when it comes to resolving those issues. Has that been enough for you as a reassurance?
I think that what they have said subsequently has been encouraging, but what I would say is that from government point of view, they should be proactive in making investors feel welcome. I mean, that is exactly what ease of doing business is, right? And now you have this whole thing about states competing with each other to get capital. I think these are positive things, because you have to function in a resource constraint. You should not think that capital is available and you can use it the way you like. So I would say that a lot of communication is happening, but communication on these fronts will be far more appreciated and will clearly make the investors feel very comfortable.
Okay. Talking about federalism, let me put that to you as well, Raju. Do you feel it has been a positive in terms of, again, adding to the ease of doing business going forward?
I think no doubt. I think one of the ways of getting the execution done is to empower the states, because I think when voters feel that they're voting for their economic benefit, then I think the natural corollary of that is you're going to get more free markets, less taxation, less bureaucracy. Which is the very simple formula, and will deliver growth. Ultimately, all these reforms are headed towards getting India to grow more quickly, more effectively, and also providing a certain place where companies, investors can actually do business. So I think it's enormously helpful and it's a great way of doing it, is to empower the states, empower the states directly, so they're competing. And as I said, repeat, through that competition, you're going to get hopefully something more akin to free markets, which is what the government essentially is doing, is dismantling the bureaucracy.
So we've got the Prime Minister's visit coming up later this week. What's the mood on the ground ahead of that? Given that he has already, been the sort of focus of a lot of criticism as well, given his foreign policy. But on the other hand, the other school of thought has been talking about how it's essential to boosting ties in terms of trade and economic development. What's the mood here in London among investors as you look forward to his visit?
Well, I think even ahead of the visit, I think post the election, the mood on the ground here and everywhere else, I think, has been very positive. And the expectation, I think, has been set, especially after what he achieved as the CM in Gujarat. So I don't think that's changed. I think maybe the temperature of it gets turned up a bit, because the visit is imminent and people are beginning to talk about it. But I think it's been positive since the election, some of which has been delivered, and I think the act of actually coming may actually turn the temperature up a bit and get people more focused, investors more focused on the reforms and the reforms to come in India.
All right. Anything specific that you want to hear, Manish?
See, I mean, I would say, just to lead into what my colleague has said here, in the sense that, it's positive what Prime Minister is doing in terms of communication. Because I often believe that, India was far less known before. So, of course, he will get criticized for his foreign trip. But I say that if you don't say who you are and what you do and what you want to do, people will have varied interpretations. So you might as well put that out in public, what you're trying to achieve. So I think that's a big positive. In terms of, what I would like to hear, and I don't know if he will touch on the policy side of things, but as I said, that in India, what has often happened is that, when you change the government, you can't repaint the car and not change the engine. I mean, so you have to really talk about, how you are making the bureaucracy work better, business work better. Those things are very, very vital. And when you talk about infrastructure, it's not just about the roads. It's about the legal system. It's about the internet. It's about technology. Right. So I think Prime Minister's visit to Silicon Valley was very good, because, we are in a changing world where it is not government to government talk. Government can talk directly to the business and implement the change. Yeah. So I would say that if I hear more about how he's changing the way business is done, or how the bureaucracy works, or how he's cutting red tape, I think that will be very, very useful to know.
All right, and we are talking about a packed house at Wembley with an audience of about 85,000 people, so it's definitely going to be interesting to see the Prime Minister's speech there. But let's talk about markets as well, and what the way forward really is looking like in terms of that. Manish, let me get your sense. I know you said we benefited from the fall in commodity prices and so forth, and we're at a relatively sweeter spot currently compared to other emerging markets. But what is the way forward? What's the upside that you're looking at?
Sure. So if you look at where we are positioned in terms of Fed and ECB, I mean, now that Fed has boxed itself into a corner, maybe they will go and raise the rates in December. But if you look at forward-looking data, and there are many forward-looking data which is not very encouraging. So that is first thing, that Fed is still going to be supportive. Second is that as soon as the uncertainty about the Fed rate rise is removed, and to the extent that you have seen some emerging market central bankers urging Fed to raise rates to remove this uncertainty. So I think you will still have some tailwind in that sense. In terms of the market positioning, market has gone underweight emerging market. Like, to give you statistics, the sell-off that happened in September, a lot of high-yield investors are back buying high-yield bond, but not the equity investors in emerging market. They're still underweight. So I would say that, there's still a lot of support for emerging market. There will be some challenging time, because whenever dollar goes strong and the yield increases, emerging markets do face the challenge, so you will have that. But I'm still thinking that, emerging market will have a decent run going forward, not because of the spooking from rate rise.
All right, Raju, what do you feel in terms of where India stands vis-a-vis its peers at the moment?
I think India, relative to other emerging markets, has done relatively well on a relative basis in terms of performance. I think if you're looking at, more specifically, if you look at the recent earnings, they've come down. Analysts are downgrading earnings going forward. So that doesn't look enormously encouraging. But I think where India is positioned from where it was when the Fed was talking about raising rates in, I think, 2013, the macros are very different now. So the current account deficit is much improved. The foreign reserves are more significant. And so I think from that perspective, India is probably better able to take a rate hike. But nonetheless, in the short term, when rates do go up, high-yield emerging markets are going to suffer. Whether that, over the long term, that's a fundamentally good thing, I think is a different question. I believe it is. I think the Fed should be raising rates. It shouldn't be keeping it where they are. And we've written to our investors and be very circumspect about the Fed raising rates, but I think they're going to have to. And in the short term, India and emerging markets will suffer.
Top minds in the legal industry here in London and addressing some of the key concerns or priorities that the industry has, particularly ahead of the Prime Minister's visit later this week. Joining us today, we've got Shantanu Basu from Duane Morris, and we've also got Narayan Iyer of Linklaters. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Absolute pleasure having you with us today. Lots, of course, that we want to talk about with you, and I just want to start off, of course, with really what steps you feel have been made in terms of the ease of doing business, in terms of really addressing foreign companies in the legal field that want to, in fact, look at India, and whether or not you feel the government has made enough steps on that front. Narayan, if I could just start off with you.
Well, there's two separate issues here. One is whether international firms can operate in India or not. But speaking about our clients in terms of investing in India, India remains a very critical market globally. It remains a critical market for our clients. Since Mr. Modi took government, there hasn't been a tapering off of investment into India. That continues. It remains very important. And his efforts in trying to make it easier are well regarded.
Okay. What's your view?
Well, I think one of the key issues that my clients face in India is the first step is really opening up more sectors under the automatic route. I think that's been a progressive move under the Modi government. Yeah. However, I think that is only half the story told. The rest of the story really remains is how easy, once foreign investors come in, is it to open up a company? Why do you still need a resident director? Right. Why are the valuation norms still what they are? And I could go on a long laundry list. And I think those are the more specific administrative issues which still need to be resolved along with the opening up of different sectors.
Right. So let's take some of those one by one. I mean, we've had a lot of course, press around the entire MAT issue, and some big cases, of course, still that need resolving. Is that a big concern among investors or your clients here? How is that being perceived?
Well, when MAT was first spoken about, it made clients very nervous, of course. And then when it was withdrawn in September, it made clients very happy. And I think there's a clear decision on part of the government, as with Mr. Modi's vision of making business in India a lot easier, making it a very investment-friendly destination. So the decision to withdraw MAT and not apply it to international investors, FIIs in particular, hedge funds and the like, that's been received quite positively. If nothing else, it's led to a lot of relief in the investor community. And that relief hopefully will translate into further investment into India.
Okay. Shantanu, what do you feel? Has the issue been accurately addressed, or are there still concerns?
I think the issue has been very maturely handled, because this was in many ways a legacy issue.
Okay.
A lot of notices started being issued under the MAT regime several months before the Modi government came into power. But at the same time, I believe that the key lesson that I have learned from my clients, what my clients feel on this, is that this is a recurring issue that can occur on a variety of aspects of the tax code. And it's really, how do you make behavioral changes to the tax administrators? Right. How do you ensure that every ward tax officer behaves in the same way in implementing or taking the same view? How do you prevent the regulatory arbitrage between different wards? And I think those are more critical issues which needs to be addressed along with the lessons from the MAT.
Okay, you know, the other issue is that a lot of problems continue to crop up just when you feel that things are starting to get resolved and there's going to be a bit of peace and calm. We have yet another storm that comes our way. So what do you feel is required? Do we need a comprehensive review of certain pockets, for instance, maybe even the Income Tax Act or retrospective provisions? You know, where do you feel the problem is? Even on the transfer pricing front, for example, we just you know, have had some amount of clarity slowly emerging, but do you feel that enough progress has been made?
I mean, the honest answer is, of course, more progress can be made. There's no doubt about that. I think it'd be unfair, though, to write off this government. I mean, there's been a lot of talk following the Bihar elections that the reforms that were promised haven't come through. I don't think that's entirely fair or accurate. I think the government needs a little more time to let this mentality filter through to the bureaucracy. And as you were saying, even in relation to the way taxes are implemented across the piece, it is a large country, it is a large bureaucracy. I think the message is coming from the center. So the short answer is, of course, things could have been different, they could have been quicker, but they're certainly heading in the right direction. There is optimism. India still remains a 7 to 7.5% growth economy. People seem to forget that in a lot of the hubris.
That's true. Everyone's always waiting to, of course, see how that growth level will continue to spurt. Yeah. But in terms of the bankruptcy provisions as well and the code there, what needs to be seen there?
I think India's had a variety of romances with different types of bankruptcy legislation. The first one being a 1920 legislation, which still happens to be on the statute books. But I think there are two key issues there. How quickly can you free up capital from a sick enterprise without going through a morass of regulation, a Byzantine network of regulations like the BIFR in the past? And how quickly can you give recourse so that the capital can be freed up and parked onto the balance sheet where it belonged in the first place? So to that extent, I think the finance minister's proposed bankruptcy code is going to lay the foundation stones. But again, I agree with Narayan that there is a fair amount of optimism that if at all this government needs to do something, it's along with the legislation to put in place the right framework of specialists to be able to quickly resolve these matters. So the MAT issue, the government put in a panel under a retired judge who came out with a report in 3 months. If something like that could be done on the bankruptcy angle as well, I think there's a good parallel from the Competition Commission where specialists in different fields can quickly resolve issues. So greater use of technocrats in that particular field, along with a more enabling legislation. I think those are the two main takeaways for me.
Okay. What about, in the entire arbitration ordinance as well? What are your views on that front? And we've still got, again, some major cases that are, of course, sort of waiting to see the outcome of what they're looking at. It's been submitted, but, we haven't actually had some clarity there. What will you be watching out for there?
I think the rule of law in India remains paramount. I think that remains one of the key reasons why investment in India continues to flourish. The issue is not so much about whether there's the right sort of decisions being made when it comes to arbitration and litigation. The issue is more of timing. And I think the problem is India's tried to reinvent itself as a bit of an arbitration hub. Right. And I think that faces challenges, that continues to face challenges. I think it'll be a while before people recognize India as an international arbitration hub in the same way they regard Singapore, London, or Hong Kong.
Okay, what do you think, Shantanu?
I think this new ordinance is trying to fix a behavioral problem. The behavioral problem is what? That a number of times why India had a bad reputation in terms of an arbitration venue is that different high courts in the country, and sometimes even the Supreme Court, took a divergent view in terms of intervening in arbitrations not fully in compliance with the letter and spirit of the earlier act. So this is an act which is trying to fix a behavioral problem, and I think that's a step in the welcome direction, that more arbitrations, international commercial ones, can happen without court intervention. But I think, again, the proof of the pudding is in seeing how it's actually implemented, whether the courts will exercise due restraint in terms of the new ordinance.
Fair enough. You know, on one hand, as we were discussing, while they've looked at the income tax side, retro provisions still something that needs to be more clarity on. The same way, in terms of resolving some of the mega cases, whether it's Vodafone, whether it's Shell, a lot of these companies that are still waiting for resolutions. M&A laws, post-deal stress for companies. I mean, what really needs to be done there? Again, is it a mix of things? I know it's fairly complicated, or is there a specific intent intent or priority that needs to be looked at in order to just make the entire process a lot simpler?
I mean, the one thing I'd like to say there is, if you look at investing in India today compared to 20 years ago, or the early 90s when India first opened up, a lot of the frustrations that faced investors no longer exist. I mean, if you were to start doing business in India today, you wouldn't imagine what it was like 20 years ago. Now, obviously, everything is relative, and you compare that as an investment destination to other similar jurisdictions. Yes, a lot more could be done, but actually it has moved over the past 20 years in the right direction in the same way. And there have been changes. For example, the Companies Act. Unfortunately, that hasn't played out as well as people would have liked. A number of clarifications coming out from the ministry, etc. But the intent, as referred to earlier as well, there seems to be a clear intent to try and make this easier for international investors to come into India.
So the overall mood then at this point, you would say, is positive from I take it from what you're just telling me, because, again, we're still waiting, whether it's other cases, even Ken, Diageo, big investors, big companies that have come into India and have had some amount of confusion or lack of transparency. But overall, currently, if you had to just sum up the mood among investors or companies looking to get into India, what would it be? I
think the favorite phrase of economists, and by implication some lawyers, is cautious optimism. I think the direction has been unilateral. It is a one-way street on which it's proceeding. But I think a lot of the specifics, like even from today's press note, a lot of the specifics need to be seen, how it's being implemented, before one can remove the word cautious from optimism.
We're almost out of time, but any key lesson to be learned, if I could just have it in just a line or two?
Well, the only lesson, and for me, which I agree with Narayan, and after so many years of watching this space, is that it is moving in the right direction. There needs to be greater speed, but also greater consistency. And sometimes one cannot replace the other. And unless and until you have a nationwide consistency in how the law is implemented, it'll always be a kind of a misbalanced boat.
Narayan, we have 20 seconds, but very, very short to wrap up lessons learned in all these years.
Lessons learned are India remains relevant, will continue to remain relevant, and will continue to attract investment.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your views with us. Absolutely fantastic talking to you today on Invest in India. Consistency, that's really what investors continue to look for when it comes to the Indian market. We leave it there for now. Lots more coming up. Do stay tuned.